Well, hello everyone, we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Joshua Banerjee. I'm the Associate Director of Research Facilities and Networks for the Water Resources Institute. Our institute works to bring together researchers and scholars from across campus, enhancing the collective impacts of UVM's water and environmental research. Today's event is a special installment of our Talks and Walks on UVM's Waterside series. The series is all about bringing UVM research into the community and exploring the connections between our landscape and our water. We are so grateful to host you here today at the Proctor Maple Research Center for today's talk. Established in 1946, the center is the oldest of its kind and serves as a global leader in maple science. Being here in Underhill in the shadow of Mount Mansfield is also incredibly fitting, as the forest serves as one of our most important living laboratories. It's a hub of long-term monitoring and research, and we have sites on the mountain with long-term records dating back to the 1950s. Here at Proctor, UVM has 100 acres of managed sugar bush on a total of 200 acres of land that allows us to conduct research that supports sugar makers across the state and beyond. It's now my pleasure to introduce the Center's Director of Scientific Research, Dr. Tim Rademacher. Originally from Germany, Tim has a career that spans several countries and some of the most prestigious research forests in the world. He earned his undergraduate and doctoral degrees at the University of Cambridge in England, where he focused on global simulations of the carbon cycle and how plants interact with the atmosphere. Tim brings a unique blend of high-tech innovation and boots-on-the-ground experience to UVM. During his time at the Harvard Forest, he gained international recognition for creating the Witness Tree Project. It is an award-winning initiative that uses sensors and algorithms to allow a century-old oak tree to tweet its physiological responses to the changing environment. He later moved to Canada, where he worked at the Centre Acer in Quebec, developing expertise in sustainable development and technical precision of the maple industry. Tim's work focuses on ensuring that as we face challenges like climate change and biodiversity loss, our maple industry remains resilient and thriving. He is a champion for collaborative cross-border science that ensures that the research we do here in Vermont helps define the future of maple production across the entire North American range. Tim is here today to show us how sugar makers tap into the water cycle and become stewards of more and more forests in the Northeast. So join me in welcoming Tim for today's talk. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you, Josh. Welcome, everybody. It's great to have you here. By the way, it's Maple Open House weekend, so we are not boiling today, but you should definitely try to get into a sugar house this afternoon. I'm not here by myself today. I have brought with me Naya Banerjee. Naya is a naturalist and field ecologist based in central Vermont. She's finishing up her master's degree at the moment in the field naturalist program. And I brought her along because her thesis is working with me on wildlife in the sugar bush. And we are going to talk a little bit about that as well and how water actually affects wildlife. So the central theme is water, but we're going to talk a little bit about maple sugaring and a little bit about how wildlife is impacted by that as well. Naya enjoys exploring the mountains and waters on foot. And yeah, she probably knows this a lot much better than I do. So welcome. I'm going to kick us off, and then Naya's going to jump in later. We're also and I will repeat this at the end of the talk, but for the walk portion, we're going to break the group into two, although we're not that many people, so we might keep it all together. And one group is going to go with Naya for the first half, and one group is going to go with me, and then we're going to change groups halfway through the talk so that everybody gets the same information, but we'll see two different bits of what we're looking at here. So, where are we today? We're at the Proctor Maple Research Center. This is where you are. You're sitting in this building right now. You can see that this is a matrix of forested land that we are part of. And as Josh was highlighting, this makes this facility really useful for a lot of additional science, not just on maple sugar. But the center itself is dedicated to the study of maple research. And actually, maple research at UVM predates the Proctor Maple Research Center. So already in the late 1800s, there was maple research at UVM. And it was only when this land was donated to the university by Governor Mortimer Proctor that the research center was founded. But we actually had research going on before that. And this research center is quite unique because it's the only research center in the world that's dedicated to the study of maple and maple sugar. There are a couple of other universities that have sugar bushes, but they don't have research centers dedicated to it. So there is Cornell, for example, with 2 sugar bushes. They don't have a single faculty member attached to it. And this is something that also changed with me arriving here in 2024, so I haven't been that long around. But I'm actually a tenure-track faculty, which means I also have a teaching commitment. And that changes how this facility is used as well over the recent past, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So we're looking back onto a long and rich history here, but our mission is really like, it's rooted in the maple sugar tree. We're really interested, in the tree itself, and we strive to contribute to practical and scholarly pursuits with regards to research, education, and extension. So our mission is really threefold. Interestingly, our mission is not to make maple syrup. That doesn't prevent us from making maple syrup. But our mission is really to help the industry with research, to educate the next generation of leaders in this industry, and to work with producers and help them to advance. I'm not working by myself here. We have a team of people that are based here. 2 of the staff members, Mark Isselhardt, who is the extension lead on maple, and Joanna Haas, who is our maple syrup quality specialist. And yes, that means her job is basically eating maple syrup. They are housed here as well. And then we have our woods crew. Wade plowed this morning, and he takes today off because he's boiling at home. And then tomorrow he's back here. Jed is doing stuff around the woods to make sure everything works today, and then tomorrow he's off to boil at home. So, we have a lot of sugaring expertise in our staff as well, actually, which is really useful. And then, something that's new is we're bringing more and more students in. So this is a cohort of summer students that worked with me last summer to look at biodiversity in the sugar bush. So, what are our current research axes? We're thinking about ecosystem health. That's a big part of what I'm really interested in. Tree health and productivity, and that's also kind of my strength. That's really where I'm coming from with I'm really interested in the physiology. Where do the sugars come from? How does the water get into the tree? We'll come back to that in a second. The water is what interests us today. And then we also do a little bit of research on sap collection and transformation and on the final product itself. So we are housing in this building the maple syrup quality lab, where producers can send in their maple syrup and we will analyze it and make sure that it corresponds to what maple syrup should be. That's a whole nother conversation, but not for today. So last but not least, on the Proctor Maple Research Center, one of the things that's relatively new is student involvement. So there used to be a maple class at UVM, and it then kind of fell off the course catalog. And when I came in, there was no maple class. And so I've created a new maple class. It's called Maple Sugaring in a Changing Environment, and we taught it last year for the first time, and the students really go through the entire production process, but also learn about the theory behind it and everything. And it's really exciting. The students loved it so much they funded a student-run maple club, and we have internships now. We have 5 students with us, working with us in the sugaring season, and there are loads of exciting new opportunities, which is really fun. We just advertised for summer interns, so if you know somebody at UVM who wants to do an internship with us this summer, we already have more than 20 applicants for 2 funded places. So, but it's competitive, but should be fun. So last but not least, as I was saying, we do make maple syrup. We don't make maple syrup because that's our mission. We do that because we want our science not to happen in an ivory tower. I can make maple syrup on a Bunsen burner in the lab. Works perfectly fine. You can make it at home on a stove. It works. The reality of the industry is not doing that. So if I want to do something that's meaningful to the industry, I need to have similar equipment. Therefore, we tap about 7,000 trees. 7,000 trees in Vermont and in the US, that's what I would call that a small commercial operation. So you get the beauty of maple, the magic of it, is you can do it from one tree in your backyard up to, there's a company that does 400,000 trees. So, you know, like, you can span that entire range. We are at the lowest range where we kind of use modern production equipment. So, and that's really important for the other missions, so that we can teach with modern equipment, that we can, you know, receive producers and they don't look at us, why are you using this? Like, this is not relevant to the industry. Yeah. That also means, as a side product, we produce about 3,500 gallons of maple syrup. It's a little bit too much for us. To, you know, just to give away to friends. Also, the university would like to see some income. So we actually sell that. Half of it goes back to the campus. This is something that a student initiated about 10 years ago or so. They were just kind of, oh, they're making maple syrup out there. We want to eat maple syrup in the canteens. Why don't you bring it over here? So we have a contract with the supplier, Sodesco, and half of our syrup is, and we are actually in the process of increasing that slowly. Come on in. Morning, Artie. How are you doing?
Better now.
Save the donut. Yeah. So about half of our syrup is going to campus, and the students eat it. The other half, we don't want to compete with local sugar makers. That's not our business. So we sell it to a bulk seller. And the way the industry is set up in Vermont, that pretty much everything you buy in a supermarket is blended. So it goes to a buyer and seller. They will buy large quantities, mix it, blend it, make sure that the flavor is average, and then put it on a supermarket shelf. And half of ours goes in these barrels out the door. So that's enough about Procter. Let's talk about the industry very quickly, because if we want to talk about water in the sugar bush, I think it's really important to understand the industry. So what I'm plotting here is the equivalent of maple syrup. The dotted line is the US, the dashed line is Canada. So one thing you see straight away is, first of all, there was an explosion of the production in Canada, and when I say Canada, what I really mean is Quebec, over the last 30 years. The other thing you realize is that 100 years ago, the US actually produced more equivalent maple syrup than we do now. And I say equivalent because we didn't make maple syrup. We made maple sugar. Maple sugar has a longer shelf life, it's easier to store, it's easier to transport, but it's the same thing, just that we take out even more water until it becomes crystal. And back then, this was a very different industry in the sense that this was mostly subsistence farmers. And that explains why if you would plot a farm abandonment in the Northeast on the same graph, the same decline here would happen. So this is basically, these were small farmers that had, you know, a woodlot as part of their farm, and it was a time of the year where they weren't too busy with other things, so they would go and make some maple sugar for themselves and their own consumption. That declined, then stabilized in around the 70s, and then it also took off again in the US. And this is really important, because one thing people don't realize is maple sugaring is ancient. You know, it's probably been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years that humans have done some form of maple sugaring, and that's not my story to tell. But, you know, it's been around a long time, and there's a lot of identity and culture attached to it. But the industry as we know it is really young. I'm older than the industry in some ways. I guess I'm getting old. But it's really exploding at the moment, and this growth is not stopping. And this industry is very different from kind of the cottage industry that we had 100 years ago. We are now working with modern production techniques, and I'll come back to all of this. High vacuum tubing, storage, like the transformation we do is very different. What's interesting is that Vermont is about half of the US production. And frankly speaking, Franklin County is by itself about a third of the US production. So it's really concentrated. It's really concentrated in a few areas. And that's not because they have better maple trees or anything, it's mostly a cultural aspect. Why this happened is a long story. My short version of it is something happened at this line, Quebec producers were really fed up with the fact that the price was jumping up and down because production was jumping up and down. We are incredibly reliant on freeze-thaw cycles. If, like this year so far hasn't been great. It's been too cold for too long, and now, yeah, we had some warm days, but they were not warm, cold, warm, cold. It was a warm period. Now it's a cold period. We're not producing anything at the moment. In bad years, the price would go up because there was no supply. In good years, the price would go down. In 1989, Quebec producers were just kind of, we have enough. Like, this is not sustainable. Let's just create a monopoly. So they did. So they founded what's called the PPAQ, Producteurs Productrices Acéricoles du Québec, which is the Quebec maple syrup producers. They control 80% of the global syrup production. They have an international strategic maple syrup reserve, which they use every year to stabilize prices. And they started doing this in '89, in December of '89, and ever since the prices have been pretty stable. And that price stabilization meant people could invest, because they would know how much they would get in the near future, roughly, for their maple syrup. We still have these annual fluctuations, and you see they are huge. Like, we still have good years and bad years, but at least you have an idea how much you will get for it. And given that Quebec controls such a large proportion of the market share, the US has largely profited from the stable prices, because everybody in the US gets paid similar prices, because most of the syrup in the US, sold in the US, is imported from Quebec. And, you know, so US producer gets similar price stability without having the drawbacks of the monopoly, actually. There are some other reasons behind this, but long story short. So let's talk about water. All of this starts, you know, with the maple tree and with water in the maple tree. I promise you this is the only scientific graph I put in. But I think this is really important, because sap is 98% water. Most of it is water. Where's that water coming from? We didn't know until last year, when a friend of mine, Elise Bouchard, published this paper, and she used isotopic traces, which is kind of a fancy scientific way of looking where the water is coming from. And she injected these kind of different molecules, atoms, into different parts of the tree, and then showed that here in dark blue, that's water that was in the base of the tree. So at the beginning of the season, you're mostly drawing on water. Almost 100% of the water that you're getting out comes from the tree itself. It was inside of the tree. But then as the season advances, there are two other things that happen. There's some water from high up the trunk that's coming in, and then there's some water from the soil. So halfway through the season, you have this shift, and the water that you're drawing out is mostly from the soil, actually. It came from the soil. So when you ask me, doesn't this hurt the tree because we take water away? That water is replaced so quickly. As a matter of fact, we are already taking water from the soil. We're not taking water away from the tree. And that's a really important part of, you know, what we're doing here. So we are kind of almost sucking water through the tree from the soil. This was done with buckets. With vacuum, these curves will probably look a little bit different. Most likely you will get to the soil water quicker, because you still get water out of the tree, but you're not starting to pour like water out of thin air through the branches, right? If we look inside of a tree, what happens is that inside of a tree there are these reserves of sugar. We call them non-structural carbohydrates. And when a tree freezes, the tree shrinks and sucks up water from the ground. And that's a simplification, but you know, there's something that's really special about the maple tree and how it's built on the inside that helps it to kind of suck up water when it's freezing. So right now, all these trees out there, they are actually sucking on water from the ground and slowly taking up water from the ground. Then, when it starts being warm enough and it thaws, the tree actually expands again and develops a positive pressure. And it's during those thaws, after a freeze, that if you poke a hole into the tree, you will get some sap that's coming out. And the sap actually contains 2% sugar. So it's 98% water, and there are a couple of other things in there, you know, plant hormones and amino acids, some minerals, but it's mostly water and sugar. Well, mostly water and a little bit of sugar, but you know, the sugar is important. Let's be real. So the sugar is really important, but one of the things people don't realize about the sugar is that's generated through photosynthesis, right? That happens in the leaves. There are no leaves on the trees right now. So that sugar was like inside of the tree. And actually, as a matter of fact, in 2016, there was a really neat study, and we're repeating that at the moment here, that showed that the sugars are also not just passing through in 1 year. They, on average, stay inside of the tree for 3 to 5 years, and some of the sugars up to a decade before we use them. So they get, produced by photosynthesis, and the tree has these decade-long reserves, and that's what we're skimming off the top a little bit every year. To get to that, we need to injure the tree. And a lot of people are worried about the health of these trees. And we talked about the water, it's not really an issue. We talked about the sugar, we're skimming off a really small amount of sugar. So in the larger scheme of things, we don't think it makes a big difference to the tree. The problem being funding cycles are generally 5 years, these trees live for 200. So it's tricky to know, how that plays out in the long term. I told you the industry is about 20, 30 years old. So if they tell you, it's sustainable, it's still a question of, are modern production techniques really sustainable over 200 years? And we have a study here studying that. It's in its 14th year. But 14 years is still pretty short for the life cycle of a tree. But in 14 years, we don't see substantial differences between trees that we tap and not. So the sugar doesn't seem to be an issue. This can be an issue. If you, like the injury you create, you need to be careful about how you create it. And actually over the last 30 years, the way we tap trees has changed massively. When you see these old pictures of massive trees with 5 buckets on them, you shouldn't be doing that. That's not a sustainable way of doing it in the long term because you actually create 5 injuries. And the important thing is every time you do this, you create this small area of what we call non-conductive wood. Wood is mostly dead cells anyways, but these cells cannot be used for sap transport. And the important thing is the tree is growing every year, and you need to balance this growth of new wood with the amount of wood you take out of circulation. That's what makes it sustainable in the long run. And that's really important. So the dimensions of this whole are really crucial. And while Naya will be talking, I'll be running out and grabbing some wood to actually show you what that looks like on the inside. I forgot it in my office. But the injury is really important. And the way we tap trees has changed quite dramatically over the last 30 years to minimize that tapping injury. And I would argue to a large degree, what we are doing now with modern production techniques, high vacuum tubing, modern spouts and so on, is actually much less detrimental to the tree than if you just had buckets. So this is what this looks like during a sugaring season. While I let this run, I'm actually going to grab those pieces of wood. So this is what this looks like on the inside. And you can see the tap hole and you can see some of the non-conductive wood. I'm going to pass this around so you can have a look at it. If you want to have a little bit of fun with it, don't look at it straight away. Look at the side and try to find the old tap holes. If I look at the bark here, I can see about 3. It's going to be a good challenge for you to try to figure out how many you can see. Point being is, they grow over and quite quickly you don't see them anymore. But if you re-drill into the same area, you're not going to get much out of it. So that's one of the big challenges. The other thing is, this infrastructure is built to bring water from the ground to the leaves, right? So the injury, while it's pretty well contained if you look at this, like it's just a hole basically just above it, in this direction, it's much bigger. So that also means if you have a tap hole, you don't want to drill above or below it the next year. That you're not going to get much out of it. So I'm going to pass this way around and this way around while we continue here. So you saw what this looks like, and we're going to have a look at this shed later. On a good day, we can get 17,000 gallons of sap. And this is one of the really important things I told you, the season might be 4-6 weeks long, but it's not every day we get a little bit. There's a handful or 2 handful of days where we make our annual crop. That's it. And you know, last week on Monday, that was one of these days. We got 17,000 gallons. You know, and on Saturday we got 100. On Sunday we got 150, and then on Monday 17,000. Obviously, there was also storm coming through. So at the same time, we had trees falling over onto the tubing, which, you know, so the technicians need to repair that, get the chainsaw out. There's 17,000 gallons. The problem with it is also you have to manage what's in the ecosystem, but you also have to, it's perishable. I call this sap collection and sap accumulation. Most people call it sap storage. You don't want to store sap. You want to accumulate it until you have enough that you can process it. It's a perishable thing. Luckily, at this time of year, most of the time it's pretty cold. So, you know, by having our silos, these are the silos just down there at the sugar house outside. That's kind of almost a free fridge. But we need to transform it as quickly as possible. So that's when the boiling comes in. Yes?
Is it bacterial growth that makes it perishable? What?
Yeah, I mean, it's sugar, right? So
Sugar,
as soon as it flows when it thaws. And if it flows really well when it thaws a lot, but that means there's sugar, water, and warm temperatures. Bacteria and microbes in general love it, right? Interestingly, there's good and bad microbes. What you associate in your head with maple, that flavor, that's not the sap itself. That's certain microbes inside of the sap that give it that flavor. So there's a certain amount of microbes that we want and that we, you know, looking for. And that also is why every producer produces different tasting maple syrup. And we could have another day on that. But, you know, you're not deciding what you're making. You're making something, and then you're tasting it. And then you go, ah, this is what I made. And then the important thing is you need to accurately grade what you've made. But we don't know the levers. We don't decide, today I'm going to make golden syrup. No. You make whatever you make, and then, you know, you deal with it. What is really important for me here is, as a sugar maker, it's one of the few agricultural industries that's really integrated. You are a steward of an ecosystem, and this is a wild harvest, so it's a quasi-natural ecosystem. Yes, we put tubing in there. Yes, we have access roads, so there is some infrastructure associated with it. And there are still open questions, and those are some of the questions that motivate Naya's work, you know, how that affects wildlife. But in general, this is not, you know, has not been raised and then replanted. People don't do maple sugaring in plantations. We do this in natural forests. Yes?
On that sort of the tapping injury, have you been able to identify when a tree would be less productive or stop producing based on those injuries?
Yeah, it's really hard.
Okay.
And maple trees, this is the blessing and the curse of the maple sugaring industry. These trees are incredibly resilient, so quite often they don't just die. They slowly decline over 20 years, which means that quite often the person doesn't realize what caused, you know, their decline. Yeah. And sometimes it's your kids that have to figure out what, you know, you did wrong. But they are very resilient, and that's a blessing, because with, you know, the changing climate, with the changing environment, maple trees are not going to go away quickly. The environment is changing, and there are very strong impacts of that, but it's pretty resilient. That's a good thing, but at the same time, to manage that ecosystem is actually really hard, because you don't see immediate effects of what's happening. It plays often out on decades. Yes?
The microbes you're speaking of, are they susceptible to the poisons that are generally being put into our atmosphere?
That's a really good question. We don't even know what we are looking at yet. We don't know half of the microbes in there, and we don't know, you know, which are the good and the bad ones. I don't think anybody has looked at how they are affected. We applied for some money this year to actually try to see what comes from within the tree. And there was some really cool work done here in the 80s by one of my predecessors, Maria Franca Morselli, and she did this really cool stuff where she aseptically tapped a tree. So she flame sterilized the drill bit and, you know, made sure that it was as aseptic as possible. And that's where she showed that you would produce light syrup all season long. While if you make a syrup normally, the color changes throughout the season. And that's mostly microbes. So the dark, stronger flavor at the end of the season, that's microbes. Not exclusively, it can also be processing equipment, but microbes play a big role in that. But we know so little about it that I don't think anybody has studied the effects of, you know, atmospheric pollution and so on. Yeah. I already talked about this briefly, but the world is changing. That means water cycles in the sugar bush are changing. We are studying that to a certain degree, so this is a study that I was involved with where we try to dry the soil in the forest. So we put out these tarpaulins to intercept water and then redirect it elsewhere to see what that would do to the functioning of the tree. And the idea was to simulate summer droughts. It was pretty timely, it turns out, because the year afterwards we had a summer drought. And everybody wanted to know what the results are. Unfortunately, interpreting the results is actually pretty complicated. Long story short again, maple trees are pretty resilient, but there is an impact. We see a reduction in sugar content. So the trees that have been dried, we think that they actually give less sugar, which would mean less syrup, right? And the difference is marginal. It's a 10%, 20% difference maybe, but for bottom line, I mean, that can be a lot, right? 10% less revenue, it's important. With that,
Quick
yes.
question on that exactly, because if the leaves are producing sugar through photosynthesis, but if you have a drought, those years correlate with obviously more sun and less cloudiness, less rain. So you would think that there would be some kind of trade-off if there's more sun producing more sugar from the photosynthesis, that you have a slightly higher sugar because of that.
It depends on what limits photosynthesis, right? And it's quite often not sunlight that's actually the limiting factor. Most of the time what limits photosynthesis is other limitations, like not having enough nutrients to build the machinery for photosynthesis. Or the other thing is plant leaves have pores in them called stomata, which exchange the gas. CO2 comes in and water goes out. So the larger you keep them open to get more CO2, more food in to make more photosynthesis, the more water you're losing. So water can become a limiting factor. So if it's nice, sunny and warm, sometimes actually the trees shut down photosynthesis because they can't lose too much water. And they become drought stressed. So it's way more complicated. And there are a lot of interacting factors. You know, water status is really important, light is really important, but so is temperature individually, so is nutrient status. And all of these things interact, and we still don't understand much of what happens once these sugars get fixed. What happens in these trees? Because most of what we study about photosynthesis is done in Arabidopsis and other small herbs. Like, there are not that many people that actually look at, you know, how is that sugar transported from up in the crown to down in the roots? Interestingly, you know, the sugar transport, the best theory we have, is almost 100 years old. And you know, there's a lot of evidence that supports that theory, but there's still a lot of questions about how exactly these things work. There's still a big question about where does the sugar actually come from that we get in maple sugaring? Because somehow that water gets taken up from the ground and there's sugar in it. And where exactly that sugar is coming from? Is it coming from root reserves? Is it coming from local reserves in the trunk? No, like, we don't know. We have theories, but we don't know.
Is the sugar stored as starch?
Mostly, yes. It's mostly stored as starch, and there's a balance between soluble sugars and starch. But that's also the question, you know. How much does the tree decide to convert from starch to sugar? Some of these trees have really high sugar concentrations. On average, it's about 2%, as I was saying. I've measured one that was 8. If all of my trees had 8, I would make 4 times as much syrup. Like, that's a huge... We haven't hit the yield ceiling with maple sugaring yet. It's constantly climbing, and we don't know what's the maximum possible. Like, what agricultural crop can say that about itself? But we don't know, you know, why there are some trees that have 8. And somebody in Ohio told me that they have measured trees with 32. I mean, that's basically syrup coming out of the tree. It doesn't make any sense. But you know, I don't know, I haven't measured that many trees. Maybe there are sweeter trees elsewhere. I need to wrap up because Naya needs some time. But there is, we have a plantation that was established by the Forest Service and Proctor in the 1960s, and we'll drive past it. So when we go to the site where we walk, have a look at it, we'll drive out and you will see, when you come to the gate, you will see a meadow with loads of instrumentation where we host a lot of research here as well, as Josh was saying. And that instrumentation does all sorts of meteorological measurements, and have a look at that. And then after that, there's kind of a woodlot that looks a bit peculiar because all the trees are neatly aligned and everything. That's actually a progeny trial. So they surveyed 21,000 trees in the Northeast, picked the sweetest one, and had like their descendants planted there. Nobody looked at that for 60 years, and one of my PhD students started doing measurements like 2 weeks ago on those trees. And we are trying to figure out, you know, is it even heritable? Like, how much is environment versus genetics? These trees are in a pretty poor soil and poor environment, so they all look pretty miserable. So, you know, anything that would be passed down would be genetic. And there's a lot to that as well, but I want to pass over to Naya here so that she can talk a little bit about more the wildlife aspect of it.
Thanks, Tim. So my mind is still spinning from all those cool facts about the sugar uptake of the maple trees. So if that wasn't complicated enough, let's zoom out to the ecosystem in the sugar bush. So here's an example of a spot at Proctor. So you can see the lines running through there. And the other thing that you see is the water, where that 98% is coming from. And so let's think a little bit about where all this water is flowing in the landscape. So this is a map of the Proctor parcel in red over there. And we're, I don't know if you can see this pointer, but we're right over here in that building that Tim showed you at the beginning, at the end of this black road. And if you squint a little, you can see, well, you can see these contour lines show how we're on the sort of western slopes of Mount Mansfield. So the water that's coming from the rain and the ground is all kind of flowing in this direction. These streams flow ultimately into the Browns River and through to the Lamoille and into Lake Champlain. And if you squint a little bit more, you can see these kind of dark patches where there are various, sort of water features in the ground. The other thing that you see in this map is this is an orthophoto, which is taken at a time when the leaves were off the forest. So all this brownish area is mostly hardwood, and the green is conifer cover. And why that matters is because the areas where there are conifers versus where there are hardwoods, there's different kinds of conditions there. There's some reason why the conifers are growing there and not hardwoods. And that makes differences to the ecosystem. So I want to talk a little bit about all these different kinds of water features that we see at the Proctor parcel that we were seeing in the map. So we've got, of course, streams and creeks. We're going to go to one today. Streams and creeks are important in the landscape because they're supporting, all kinds of amphibian life, fish. The shade around these riparian areas is keeping the waters cool, allowing cool water-loving fish to spawn and so forth. The corridors that the streams flow in, right, those are really important for animals to move around in as they're searching for food to eat, going between different water bodies, and so on. So we've got wetlands in the west corner of Proctor, where you saw that sort of conifer forest. There's a stream going through there that beavers have been active in, and they've created this sort of emerging wetland out there. Wetlands are, habitat for beavers, mink, otter, different kind of animals that love to stay around the water. The sedges and grasses that grow here are forage for all sorts of animals. There's nesting birds that will use this as habitat. Moose like to travel here and cool off on warm days. There are, throughout the property also, these locations where either groundwater has come up out of the ground and kind of collects and pools depending on how much there's often like a layer of till or bedrock that's fairly hard for the water to get through, so it'll pool, and that allows all kinds of mosses and herbs and things to grow that love that watery sort of substrate. This is a picture of a cool swamp where red spruce and cinnamon fern are dominant. And these sort of areas provide lots of cover for breeding birds, snowshoe hare, squirrels, all kinds of little critters that like to live in here. There are vernal pools at different spots across Proctor, and you know that these are really important for as amphibian breeding grounds. And there are even man-made features like ruts in the road created by the ATVs where, oops, I gave everything away. Where you'll find different creatures. So hopefully that shows you that water is really important in the landscape for all kinds of creatures, from amphibians all the way to mammals and the trees, of course, and maybe something that we don't often focus on, a new word for today, cryptogams. So cryptogams are organisms like mosses and ferns and fungi that reproduce through spores and not through seeds. And water is very important to their reproductive cycles because their gametes use water to move between the different organisms and reproduce. And there are micro animals that live, that have habitat in these organisms. So, for example, rotifers and tardigrades you'll find living in mosses. And these are, the bottom of the food chain. So super, super important in the entire ecosystem. So those are all a lot of pictures from the summer, but things are not quiet in the winter, and water is very important in the winter as well, right? So in the winter, you might know that a lot of small mammals find shelter in this layer between the ground and the snowpack called the subnivean zone. And the way these are made is that as the snow starts to fall, you might have like a branch or leaf litter or something that kind of creates a little air pocket, And as the snow keeps falling, the warmth from the earth causes a layer of ice to form and make a sort of roof over the air pocket. And small mammals like squirrels and voles and shrews and so on, they make these very intricate tunnels all through the snowpack and down into the subnivean layer and shelter there. So you'll find, like around now in the spring when the snow starts to melt, you'll see evidence of these tunnels sort of appearing, and once the snow is all gone, you'll see little tunnels like this all over the ground, and especially in meadows, you'll find this a lot. Okay, so hopefully this has convinced you that Proctor, which is sitting in the larger landscape of this flank of Mount Mansfield, has a lot of diversity of types of water features and different sorts of plants growing in different places. And so the wildlife is moving around on this landscape, right? So this is an area that we'll visit when we go out, and it's kind of a game trail that the animals seem to use to go down to a creek. You can see the bear sort of going down that path, and there's just numerous animals that are passing this way going down to the creek. Let that play for a little bit.
Do any of these animals drink the sap directly, find ways to drink the sap directly?
So, not that I've noticed. I know the squirrels certainly do, and I think that we've had evidence of animals like bear being curious about the lines, and I don't know if they've ever found drops of sap or anything coming out of it. But I have a feeling that the concentration is so low that they might not really realize that that's a source of significant sugar.
The calorific gain of drinking sap is minimal. What Naya was saying correctly, that squirrels squirrels were probably the first sugar makers, and a lot of myth and legends by indigenous people on how they, around their lore around and legends around sugaring start with an animal having shown them, and quite often they involve squirrels or other animals. And we know that squirrels, there was a really cool study done by a UVM faculty member in the 80s that actually observed squirrels, and we know that they either intentionally injure or go to injuries, and they don't drink the sap, but they let it drop and evaporate, and the residue is much higher in sugar content, and they come back and lick it. So they get like their sweet treat out of it. So there is certainly some kind of animal sugaring. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a number of years ago, I talked to Louis Porter, who was head of Fish and Wildlife back then, and I said, what's the impact of tubing on wildlife passage? And he said it's not significant except for moose. But what is significant is in a sugar bush, if competing trees are cut down, then you lose the mast, the seeds, the nuts that feed. So what are the means of forest management in this sugar bush in terms of cutting down competing trees to sugar maples?
Do you want me to answer that?
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right. I think it's really interesting to see this, and even the moose story. We have footage of moose elegantly weaving through the tubing. Right? Yeah. So I can show you that we definitely have moose here, and they don't seem to care too much. That doesn't mean it doesn't affect them, right? It could still mean that it makes it harder, especially with a huge snowpack, and makes them less fit. But I agree that there's no really strong evidence that the tubing has a massive effect. The management of the system, and this is why we talk about all of this, as sugar makers, we are stewards of this ecosystem. And how we manage that ecosystem is really important. There are the latest guidelines on how to manage a sugar bush are from the 80s and 90s, when tubing and high vacuum wasn't a thing. So a lot of sugar bushes are still managed for buckets, and some of the guidance, unfortunately, is cut out everything that's not a maple because that doesn't give you money, and keep understock so that you get really big maple trees, because it's easier to have 5 buckets and only go to one tree than to go 5 different trees. So unfortunately, some of the guidelines are outdated, and we're working on that at the moment. One of the things we don't even know is what a typical sugar bush looks like. I can tell you what Proctor looks like. The way it was managed here was actually to simulate natural disturbance. So there's still a lot of diversity in terms of plants, and we have started measuring this with students last year, the amount of diversity in trees and in understory species and in fungi and in bryophytes. We are going out this year to other sugar bushes and look at what that looks like in other sugar bushes. Anecdotally, I have seen a correlation between the longer the sugar bush has been sugared, the more maple are around. And there is an implicit bias if I'm a maple sugarer. If there's a birch tree and a maple tree and I want to thin, I'm more likely to cut the birch tree because the maple tree makes me money. Which over time, so quite often the 8th generation sugar bush, those are actually the sugar bushes that sometimes are more tending towards a monoculture. But that's purely anecdotally. Like, there is no data on it, and this is something that we're trying to build at the moment. We want to even understand how does it affect it, because there are one of the really good things, and then I'll let Naya get back to this, is most of the crop, 80% of the crop in Vermont, don't quote me on that number, but I think it's 80, is organically certified. And organic certification requires you to have at least 25% of your trees to be non-sugar maple. And that number, 25, has been picked arbitrarily. But one of my ambitions is that at some point we can tell you, what's the right good mix to create a stable and resilient ecosystem. Because one of the things is, if you have 100% maple and you get a disturbance that affects maple, that's an all, like, let's say, a defoliator that loves maple leaves, that's an all-you-can-eat buffet. So you want to avoid that. So just from a forest management perspective, but foresters do all sorts of different things, and the forest management aspect, there is no specific guidelines for forest management in sugar bushes. There are some really smart foresters that do smart multi-purpose management, but there are clearly also some people who only think about the short-term profit and cut everything that's not a maple. Yeah.
I did read a paper, I don't remember exactly where it came from, but in the tree diversity in any forest, it's good to have a good diversity because each tree pulls different nutrients. Each tree, when they drop their leaves in the fall and it rots, that creates different types of minerals and nutrients to the trees. So to have a diversity of conifers and birch, beech, oak, everything, they all rot and do different acids and different minerals to the trees, which can help the maple trees in general.
Yeah, and there are really well-established principles in ecology that tell us that generally having a more diverse ecosystem is a really good thing. It's also sometimes a good thing for less obvious things. They're more indirect effects. Give you an example. Some sugar makers hate squirrels with a vengeance because the squirrels chew on their tubing. We don't have squirrel problems here, but we have a lot of animals that eat squirrels here. But you only have animals that eat squirrels if the other habitat requirements are suitable. If you don't have, certain types of conifers that predatory birds nest in, you are less likely to have them around and them eat your squirrels. So sometimes the ecosystem can get out of whack. But all of these things at the moment are mostly speculative. I can't tell you at this stage, oh, you have this problem because of this. I can speculate, but we still know very little about this ecosystem and the interactions. How the tubing affects the animals.
Right, and so to your question, this was one of the things that we were trying to gather data on. So this is a map of the parcel, not totally updated, but you can see these black lines are where the main lines are, which are those like black 1 inch, 1 3/4 inch kind of PVC pipes. And then the blue lines that you're sort of familiar with seeing in the forest, I don't know if this is working or not, but they are branching off of these black lines like fingers. So it really like covers the forest in a certain sense. And so we'd like to understand, as animals are encountering this tubing, are they changing their behaviors or anything else? Or is the tubing causing other effects like, lack of a certain kind of understory or more of a certain kind of understory or any of that? And how does it all, work together is something we're just gathering information on. So here's some of the encounters that we captured of animals, as they come across these, as this tubing network. And like you said, the ones that encounter it most directly are the moose and perhaps the deer.
Are there particular animals that chew on the lines themselves, or
Besides
squirrels?
Yeah, I've heard of squirrels, I've heard of even coyotes chewing on them, but as Tim said, that doesn't seem to be a huge problem at Proctor, and it's a good question why. And we also saw a sort of unexpected
I'm going to pass
use
around
of
some.
the tubing.
Yeah, I'm going to pass around some pieces, and you can try to figure out which animal did this. Do animals chew on it? Definitely. If it has teeth, or even if it doesn't, it will probably try to, even woodpeckers sometimes go for it. Yeah,
So you have a lot of raptors, is what you're saying?
Well, they are around.
Yeah.
They are in the forest, yeah. And I think I'll end there.
Yeah, so there's a question for you.
One quick question, you mentioned the saw the animals going nicely under
Yeah.
those tubes.
Sorry, Jill, I can't hear.
Yeah, your pictures show the animals nicely going underneath the tubing.
Yeah.
But you also made reference to the fact that in the winter,
Yeah.
when there's a lot of snow, I wonder if you have evidence in the winter from your game cameras of animals having any problems with the tubing?
So it's interesting, I was hoping to see some moose going through in the winter, and one of the things that I found about moose is that they were using a very specific trail through the property. So I mean, of course I haven't been able to see everywhere they go, but they were heavily using like a forest road that goes up, somewhat avoiding the lines, but having to go through some of them. But I haven't seen them come back in the winter yet. So, an open question.
In the absence of animal gnawing, what is the typical lifetime of the tubing?
It depends, and I will revisit that with my group when we're outside.
Okay.
Because it will be easier when we look at the tubing network to actually talk you through that, because it's not all of the tubing is the same. That's the short answer. So let's revisit that outside. Hold me accountable. Let's talk about the age and life cycle of the tubing. Okay. With that, let's. Do we want to break the group up into, or is this reasonable to do this in one?
We may still want to break up into two.
Okay, so we'll just split you right in the middle here, and this side of the room will come with me initially, and that side of the room will go with Naya initially. We're gonna go drive back down to the end of Marvin Taylor Road, turn left, and then down here, all of this tubing converges to a little shed. That's one of our pumping stations. Wade plowed there for us, so there should be some parking, but if we could carpool to get as many people as possible into the least amount of vehicles to get down there. And while you go out there, when you get to the gate, have a look. There's this meadow on the left with all sorts of instrumentation. Like Beverly has some equipment out there, for example, for the Summit to Shore network and so on. That's really important as ancillary data. But we'll meet down here at the shed and start our walk from there. Okay.
Cross-country skiing.
Uphill that way, yeah.
Yeah. You know, we're like,
Where do you go?
well, we did our backcountry ski, we start our back door.
Yep.
We live right close to the reservoir.
Oh,
So we can ski kind of all through the woods from there. And then for groomed areas, we have seasons membership to the Craftsbury.
oh, that's the best.
We love
They are the best.
Some trees they are making, because it is time, it is, you know, equipment, it is material cost, and some trees, that's where you make all of your money, but you, like at the moment we're shooting in the dark. People talk about crown, people talk about, you know, but there's very little scientific work so far on it, but all the work that has been done, there is no correlation between, you know, having a bigger crown and giving sweeter sap. Don't do it.
So is the drop line full of liquid usually, or there air?
A little bit of both, depends on the timing, and yeah, it can be both.
Now, are you